The sun rose over the valley of Jezreel like the eye of Ra himself, burning away the morning mist to reveal what no man present would ever forget. From the narrow mouth of the Aruna Pass, the Egyptian army spilled forth onto the plain. Column after column of bronze-tipped spears, chariots with wheels wrapped in leather, archers with bows of horn and sinew. They had gambled everything on a single desperate march through a defile so tight that men moved single-file horses, nervous and stumbling, certain that ambush would come with every step. It had not come. Now spread before them like pieces on a gaming board, the enemy waited. The coalition of Canaanite kings, rulers of ancient cities whose names would echo through scripture and conquest, had arrayed themselves across the plain, confident that the Egyptians would arrive. Exhausted and scattered from the long northern roads, they had prepared for an army emerging from safe routes. They had not prepared for this. At the head of the Egyptian host rode Thutmose III, Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands. Still young enough that some whispered he was untested, still bold enough that he had ignored every adviser who told him the narrow pass meant death. On this morning in the 15th century, before the Common Era, before Homer sang of Troy, before Rome was even a dream, the greatest military mind of the ancient world was about to write the first detailed account of battle that humanity would preserve. What happened in the hours that followed would be carved into temple walls, recorded on papyrus, studied by commanders for 3 zeros, 0 years. The kings of Canaan had raised their banner in rebellion. The Pharaoh of Egypt had come to break them. Between these two forces lay a city older than empires, sitting astride trade routes that connected continents. Megiddo, whoever held it commanded the crossroads of the ancient world. Whoever lost it would fade into the dust of forgotten kingdoms. The chariots began to form their lines. The infantry set their shields. Across the plain, the coalition stirred like a disturbed hive, horns blowing in alarm, commanders shouting orders that echoed against the hills. Neither side yet understood that this moment would transcend them all, that the violence about to unfold would become the first battle that future ages could read about in detail. The first time human beings recorded not just who won, but how victory was seized and how defeat was delivered. The gate of empire stood open. Only blood would decide who walked through. When Thutmose II died, the empire he left behind stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the trading cities of the Levantine coast. It was vast, wealthy, and held together by the simple understanding that Egypt's armies were unstoppable and its pharaohs divine. For a generation, tribute had flowed south like the Nile itself. Cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, silver and grain, and slaves from vassal cities that knew the alternative to cooperation was ash and empty streets. Then came the boy king. Thutmose III was young when he took the double crown. Young enough that for years his stepmother Hatshepsut ruled as regent, conducting trade and building monuments, while the actual business of kingship, the leading of armies, the crushing of rebels, went dormant. The vassal cities in Canaan and Syria watched this. They saw a pharaoh who built temples instead of marching. They saw an Egypt grown soft and distracted. They saw opportunity. The king of Kadesh saw it most clearly of all. Kadesh was an old power, a city-state that sat on the Orontes River far to the north, commanding the approaches to the Hittite lands beyond. Its king understood that if the Canaanite cities could unite, if the fractious feuding kingdoms between the Mediterranean and the desert could put aside their centuries of rivalry, they might break free of Egyptian dominion entirely, not just refuse tribute but push Egypt back, reclaim the trade routes, control the flow of wealth that had once gone south to Thebes and Memphis. He sent messengers to every city that had ever chafed under Egypt's hand, to Megiddo, the fortress that controlled the valley crossroads, to Jerusalem, ancient even then, to the coastal cities and the hill towns and the chiefs of tribes who moved with the seasons. The message was simple. Egypt is weak. Egypt is distracted. Egypt will not come. They believed him. One by one, the cities stopped sending tribute. One by one, they raised their own banners and swore oaths to the coalition. By the time Hatshepsut died and Thutmose III stood alone as sole ruler of Egypt, the entire Levant was in open rebellion. The coalition had gathered its armies at Megiddo, the strongest fortress in Canaan, the city that sat like a stopper in the neck of the valley, controlling every road that connected Egypt to the north. For the young pharaoh, the choice was brutally clear. March north and break the rebellion, or watch the empire his fathers built crumble into independent kingdoms and lost provinces. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. Either Egypt's armies would restore the natural order of the world with the Pharaoh supreme, and the vassal cities obedient, or Egypt would become just another kingdom among many, mortal and limited and small. Thutmose III was 22 years old. He had never commanded an army in battle. The veterans who surrounded him were men his father's age, scarred from campaigns in Nubia and Syria, accustomed to long marches and the weight of bronze armor under desert sun. They did not doubt their pharaoh's divinity. That was not in question. They doubted whether divinity alone could win battles when the enemy held the high ground and the fortified cities and commanded forces that by some estimates numbered in the tens of thousands. But the young pharaoh possessed something his enemies had not accounted for. A mind that thought in angles and distances, and time that understood terrain as a weapon and surprise as a force multiplier. He would not simply march north and batter himself against Megiddo's walls. He would do what they thought impossible. He would arrive where they did not expect him when they were not ready, and in doing so, he would teach every general who came after him the first and most enduring lesson of warfare. The unexpected path is often the winning path. The Egyptian army that assembled at the border fortress of Chariots was a sight that would have stirred the hearts of every soldier who had ever marched under the standards of the pharaohs. 20,000 men, perhaps more. The ancient sources disagree, and numbers in that age were measured more in impressions than precise counts. What mattered was that it was vast, disciplined, and equipped with the finest weapons that Bronze Age technology could produce. At its core were the infantry, spearmen with shields of wood and hide, axes of bronze that could split a skull or shatter a shield rim, swords that were more like long daggers, designed for the brutal close work of a shield wall. They wore simple kilts and leather caps, some with scale armor that rattled as they marched, most with nothing but their own skin and the protection of their gods. The chariots were the pride of Egypt, the striking arm that turned battles and broke formations. Light, fast, built of wood and leather and bronze fittings. Each carried 2 men, a driver to control the horses, and a warrior with bow and javelin to rain death on the enemy. They were the tanks of their age, the elite force that only the wealthiest kingdoms could field in numbers. Thutmose had hundreds. Through the spring of 1457 BC, this army marched north along the coastal road, the ancient highway that connected Egypt to the cities of Canaan. They moved with purpose, but not haste. This was not a raid, but a reconquest, not a punitive expedition, but the reassertion of empire. Scouts ranged ahead, reporting on enemy movements, on cities that opened their gates in submission, and cities that barred them in defiance. The coalition knew they were coming. An army that size could not be hidden, could not disguise the cloud of dust it raised, or the supply trains that followed in its wake. By the time Thutmose reached the city of Yaham, 10 miles south of Megiddo, the Canaanite kings had made their choice. They would not meet him in the open field before their fortress. They would hold the valleys and the passes, forcing the Egyptians to approach through terrain that favored the defenders. It was a sound strategy. There were 3 routes from Yaham to Megiddo, and the coalition had studied them all. The first route curved west, skirting the hills through the broad, zesty valley, safe, open, but it would bring the Egyptian army to Megiddo's western approaches, where the coalition had placed strong forces. The second route swung east through the Tarn Valley, equally safe, equally watched. Both roads were wide enough for the army to march in proper formation. Both offered good visibility and room to maneuver. Both were exactly what a cautious, sensible commander would choose. The third route was the Aruna Pass. It was a defile so narrow that men would have to march single file in places. A serpentine corridor through the hills where an ambush could annihilate an army before it even knew it was under attack. The pass opened directly onto the plain before Megiddo. But reaching that opening meant hours of vulnerability, miles of constricted movement where chariots were useless, and infantry could do nothing but trust that the hills on either side held no enemies. No commander in his right mind would take the Aruna Pass. At Yahum, Thutmose called his council of war. The generals gathered in his tent. These hardened men who had fought beside his father, and they spoke with the blunt honesty that Egyptian military culture permitted. The Aruna road meant death. They said if the coalition held the heights, if they blocked the exit, the Egyptian army would be strung out like a line of ants and crushed piecemeal. The safe routes were the wise choice. Yes, the coalition expected them there. Yes, they would have to fight, but they would fight with their army intact, not scattered and ambushed in a defile. Pharaoh listened. Then he asked where the coalition expected him. The safe routes, they admitted. And where were the coalition armies gathered? At the exits of the safe routes. Thutmose announced his decision. He would take the Aruna Pass. The generals protested. They argued tactics and logistics, and the basic sanity of risking the entire army on a gamble. Thutmose let them speak. Then he gave his answer, and the ancient scribe who recorded it preserved words that ring across 3 millennia with perfect clarity. He would go forth on the Aruna road. Those who wished could take the safe routes. Those who wished could follow him. It was not a command, it was a dare. It was a challenge to the honor and courage of every man in that tent. The generals could not let their pharaoh march into danger while they took the safe path. That would be cowardice, and cowardice was worse than death. The army would take the Aruna Pass. They began the march before dawn in darkness that turned the hills into hulking shadows and made every sound echo with sinister possibility. The chariots went first, horses stepping carefully on the narrow track, wheels nearly brushing the rock walls on either side. Behind them came the infantry in a line that stretched for miles, shields on their backs, spears gripped tight. Every man knowing that if ambush came, there was nowhere to run and no room to fight. No ambush came. The coalition had placed their armies at the exits of the safe routes, certain that no general would be foolish enough to risk the Aruna Pass. By the time word reached them that the Egyptians were emerging from the hills directly before Megiddo, it was too late. The carefully prepared, defensive positions were in the wrong places. The forces meant to grind down a weary, strung-out army found themselves facing a concentrated host that had emerged exactly where it wanted to be. Thutmose III had done the impossible. He had moved his entire army through terrain that should have destroyed it, and he had done it undetected and unmolested. Now, as the last rays of daylight faded, and both armies settled into camp on opposite sides of the valley, the young pharaoh knew something his enemies did not yet understand. The battle was already half won. The rest would be decided by bronze and blood, and the will of men who believed their king was a god. The dawn came cold over the valley of Jezreel, mist clinging to the low places like a gravecloth draped over the earth. Both armies had slept poorly. Soldiers do before battle. Even veterans, even men who have killed before and know they will likely kill again. Fear does not disappear with experience. It simply changes shape. becomes a familiar companion rather than a paralyzing stranger. Thutmose III rose with the first light, performed the rituals that connected Pharaoh to gods, and then did what commanders have always done before battle. He inspected his forces, walked among them, let them see him calm and confident and utterly certain of victory. It mattered, in an age before loudspeakers and radio, before any technology that could project a voice beyond shouting distance, leadership was a physical act. The soldiers needed to see their king, needed to know he was there, needed to believe that the gods walked with them. Across the valley, the coalition army stirred into motion. They had spent the night in confusion and recrimination. How had the Egyptians gotten through the Aruna Pass? Where had their scouts been? Why had no warning come? But now, with battle inevitable, old disciplines took over. The Canaanite kings formed their forces into a rough crescent, anchoring their flanks on the high ground and placing their own chariots. Fewer than the Egyptians, but still deadly on the wings where they could maneuver, they had numbers. Estimates vary wildly, as they always do for ancient battles, but the coalition likely fielded 15 to 20 0 men, drawn from a dozen cities and tribes, unified by a rebellion and the hope that Egyptian power could be broken. They had the advantage of position, occupying ground they knew, defending a city that had never fallen to assault. They had confidence born of momentum. This was their rebellion, their moment, their chance to reshape the balance of power in the ancient world. What they did not have was unity of command. The king of Kadesh nominally led the coalition, but each city king commanded his own contingent. And in the moment of crisis, men follow those they know, not distant allies whose authority is theoretical at best. This would matter. In battle, confusion is as deadly as any weapon, and an army that hesitates, that waits for coordinated orders from multiple commanders, is an army already losing. The Egyptian formation was simpler, cleaner, built around the pharaoh's will and the discipline of professional soldiers. The infantry formed the center, a dense block of spears and shields. Thousands of men packed tight enough that their shields overlapped, creating a wall of wood and bronze that could advance or hold as one organism. On the wings, the chariots assembled in formations that would have been familiar to any cavalryman in any age. Grouped for shock, positioned for pursuit, ready to exploit any break in the enemy line, Thutmose positioned himself where every man could see him. In a chariot at the center of the line, wearing the blue war crown of Egypt, the kir, a symbol every soldier knew. Where the pharaoh stood, there was the heart of the army. Where the pharaoh went, the army would follow. The morning wore on. Both armies advanced slowly, closing the distance across the valley floor. There was no dramatic charge, no wild rush. This was Bronze Age warfare, and battles began methodically with formations moving at the pace of marching men, arrows beginning to fall, javelins thrown, the two forces edging closer until the inevitable moment when they would crash together and men would start dying in earnest. At 200 paces, the Egyptian archers began to shoot. Not wildly, not in panic, but in coordinated volleys, thousands of arrows arcing up and then down. A rain of bronze-tipped death that clattered on shields and found gaps in armor and brought the first screams from the coalition line. The Canaanites had archers too, and they replied. But their formation was looser, their command structure fragmented. Some units shot, some held their arrows, some waited for orders that came late or not at all. At 100 paces, the Egyptian chariots on the wings began to move. Not a charge, not yet, but an advance at the trot, gaining speed, wheels rumbling over ground, horses snorting and tossing their heads. The chariot warriors held their bows ready, javelins at hand, waiting for the moment when they would be close enough to kill. At 50 paces, the coalition line began to waver. It was not obvious at first, not a dramatic collapse, just a subtle shift. Men leaning back instead of forward, shields coming up instead of leveling for combat, the natural human instinct for self-preservation beginning to override training and discipline. They were watching the Egyptian center, that massive block of infantry advancing like a bronze-tipped battering ram. And they were watching the chariots on the wings, and they were doing the math that every soldier does when facing superior forces and better coordination. Then the Egyptians charged. It was not the entire line. Thutmose was too skilled for that, too aware that a charge that failed would turn into a rout. Instead, he committed his chariots first, sending them hurtling forward in a thundering wave that hit the coalition flanks like a hammer striking pottery. Horses slammed into men, wheels crushed the fallen, chariot warriors shot arrows at point-blank range and threw javelins that punched through shields and bodies alike. The coalition flanks broke. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the terrible progressive collapse that marks the end of an army's cohesion. First one unit pulled back, then another, then a whole section of the line began to stream away from the Egyptian chariots. And once movement starts, once the formation cracks, panic spreads faster than fire in dry grass. The Egyptian infantry hit the center while the flanks were still disintegrating. There was no finesse here, no tactical genius, just the brutal physics of shield meeting shield. Spear finding flesh, axes rising and falling, men pushing and shoving and screaming as they tried to drive the enemy back or die trying. The noise must have been overwhelming. 10-0, 0 men shouting, metal clashing on metal, wounded crying out, officers bellowing orders that no one could hear over the general din. The coalition's center held longer than the flanks, but it could not hold forever. With their wings collapsed and Egyptian chariots beginning to swing in behind them, with the disciplined Egyptian infantry pressing forward step by relentless step, the Canaanite kings made the decision that would doom them. They ordered a retreat. Not a rout, not yet, but a withdrawal back toward Megiddo to the safety of walls and gates, and the towers that could support them with arrows and slings. It was the sensible choice. It was also exactly what Thutmose wanted. An army in retreat is an army vulnerable. And the Pharaoh unleashed his chariots for the pursuit. What happened next became legend. The coalition forces ran for Megiddo. A desperate scramble across the valley toward walls they could see but could not quite reach, and the Egyptian chariots ran them down. It was slaughter, pure and simple, the kind of violence that happens when one force completely dominates another, and the losing side has nowhere to hide. Men threw down their weapons, their shields, anything that might slow them. And still the chariots came on, still the arrows fell, still the javelins found targets, the gates of Megiddo opened to receive the fleeing soldiers. They poured into the city in a chaotic mass, and the Egyptian forces, drunk on victory, and the primal joy of pursuit surged after them. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like Thutmose might take the city right then, might ride through the gates on the backs of the fleeing enemy and end the rebellion in a single day. But the defenders recovered. The gates slammed shut, sealing hundreds of coalition soldiers outside, men who beat on the wood and screamed to be let in while Egyptian soldiers cut them down. Inside the walls, the garrison finally organized, and from the towers and battlements, a storm of arrows and stones began to fall on any Egyptian who came too close. Thutmose called off the assault. He had won the battle. The field was his. The coalition army broken and scattered. Dead and dying men carpeted the valley. How many, the sources do not say, but enough that the scribes recorded it as a great slaughter. Enough that the Pharaoh's annals spoke of capturing nearly 1,000 chariots and 2,000 horses, of taking prisoner thousands of enemy soldiers. But Megiddo itself remained unconquered, its walls intact, its gates barred, and inside those walls were the kings who had started this rebellion. The battle was over, the siege was about to begin. For 7 months, the Egyptian army ringed Megiddo with earth and timber, and the patient determination of men who knew that time was now their ally. They built a wall around the city, not to assault it, but to starve it. A circumvention that cut off every road, every path, every possibility of escape or resupply. Inside the walls, the coalition leaders watched their food stores dwindle and their people begin to suffer, and they understood what every besieged force eventually understands. Courage and defiance cannot be eaten. The ancient sources tell us little about those 7 months. The scribes who carved Thutmose's annals into temple walls were interested in glory and divine favor, not the tedious details of siege, logistics, and negotiations. But the reality was simple and brutal. Every day the supplies inside Megiddo decreased. Every day the Egyptian grip grew tighter. Every day the hope of relief grew dimmer. The coalition had gambled that other cities might come to their aid, that allies from the north or east might break through the Egyptian siege lines and restore their fortunes. No such relief came. No such relief came. The cities that had joined the rebellion now watched from a distance, calculating whether it was wiser to submit to Egypt or share Megiddo's fate. One by one they chose submission. Inside Megiddo the arguments must have been fierce. Some would have urged resistance to the end, preferring death to the humiliation of surrender. Others would have counseled pragmatism. Better to live as vassals than die as heroes. Better to preserve their cities and their people than sacrifice everything for pride. In the end, pragmatism won. It almost always does when the alternative is starvation. When the gates finally opened, it was not with resistance, but with submission. The kings of the coalition came forth bearing the symbols of surrender, tribute of gold and silver, weapons laid down, oaths of loyalty spoken in the ancient formulas that conquerors have always demanded, and the defeated have always given. They prostrated themselves before the Pharaoh, these men who had dreamed of independence, who had believed Egypt could be pushed back and a new order established. The king of Kadesh escaped. Somehow, in the chaos of the siege, or through secret negotiations, he slipped away before the final surrender, fled north to his own city to plot and scheme and wait for another opportunity. Thutmose would spend the next 2 decades chasing him, campaigning season after season in Syria and along the Orontes, never quite catching the man who had started it all. But the others submitted, and Thutmose accepted their submission because he understood something fundamental about empire. Dead vassals pay no tribute. The Pharaoh took what he needed. The spoils were immense. Nearly 1,000 chariots, 2-0 horses, thousands of prisoners who would be marched south to labor on Egypt's monuments and work Egypt's fields. The coalition princes sent their sons and brothers to the Egyptian court as hostages, a guarantee of future good behavior. The trade routes that made Megiddo valuable in the first place were now firmly in Egyptian hands, and the tribute that had stopped flowing during the rebellion began again, heading south to fill the treasuries of Thebes and Memphis. But Moses did not burn Megiddo. He did not massacre its people or tear down its walls. That was not how empire worked, not how a smart conqueror maintained control. He needed these cities functional, their people productive, their rulers cooperative. Terror had its place, but so did mercy, and the Pharaoh understood when to use each, but he did something else. Something that would echo across 3 zeros, 0 years, and make this battle matter far beyond its immediate strategic consequences. He ordered it recorded in detail with numbers and dates and descriptions of tactics and terrain. The Annals of Thutmose III became the first detailed military account in human history, carved into the walls of the Temple of Ammon at Kerak, preserved on papyrus scrolls that scribes would copy and study for generations. For the first time, A battle was not just a vague memory or a boastful inscription. It was a documented event. The route chosen, the trap set, the flanks broken, the pursuit unleashed. Future commanders would read these accounts and learn from them. Alexander the Great, 21 centuries later, would study Egyptian military records. Roman generals would debate the wisdom of Thutmose's choice at the Aruna Pass. The battle became more than history. It became instruction. The sun set over the valley of Jezreel, and the field where 20,000 men had fought for the future of empires was quiet now. The dead had been buried or burned, the wounded tended or abandoned to die, the survivors already marching south with their pharaoh toward the glories that awaited them in Thebes. Megiddo's gates stood open, its walls intact but its power broken, a testament to the price of rebellion and the reach of Egypt's spear. Thutmose III returned to Egypt not just as a king who had inherited power, but as a conqueror. The young pharaoh who had gambled on a narrow pass and won, who had outmaneuvered his enemies and broken them before their greatest fortress, had proven himself in the way that mattered most to the ancient world. He would campaign for another 30 years, push Egypt's borders further than any pharaoh before or after, earn the title that history would give him, Egypt's Napoleon, the greatest military mind of the ancient world. But it all began here in this valley on this field when a young king chose the impossible path and made it possible through courage and cunning and the simple refusal to do what his enemies expected. The rebellion was crushed, the empire was restored, the natural order, as Egypt understood it, was reasserted. The pharaoh supreme, the vassals obedient, the tribute flowing south as the gods intended. And for the first time in human history, someone wrote it all down, the tactics and the terrain, the march and the battle, the siege and the surrender. They preserved the moment when human conflict became human history. When battle became not just an event, but a story that could be told and retold, studied and understood, learned from and built upon. That is Megiddo's true legacy, not just one side's victory over another. Not just the strategic consequences for Egypt and Canaan, but the simple fact that it was recorded, that it survived, that 0 years later, we can read about how a young king took a risk, how an army marched through a narrow pass, how bronze clashed on bronze under an ancient sun, and how in the violence and chaos and triumph of that day, humanity took its first step toward understanding war, not just as experience but as knowledge. The first battle that history would not forget, the moment when the recording began.